Hi, this is Dr. Rich Schuttler with Taking the B out of ABD. That stands for Taking the But out of All But Dissertation. This is a program to help you complete your dissertation easier, with far less stress, and hopefully with more fun. This is Chapter 4, Lesson Number 1. I'd like to thank you for obtaining these lessons here. I'm certain that by you listening to these lessons, it will help you better understand the expectations of how Chapter 4 could and should be designed, and that way you can meet those expectations and exceed them as well, and truly produce a significant and substantial doctoral dissertation. This is Chapter 4, Lesson 1. There's 12 different lessons in this program. This lesson is titled The Introduction to How to Write Chapter 4. There are 12 lessons in this strategy that I produced for Chapter 4. As you can see by this slide, that the first lesson is this one, the introduction to the series. Lesson 2 will follow with a field test and pilot test explanations. Then I'll start 5 sections, if you will, or 5 parts of how to present qualitative data. I'll follow that with 3 other different lessons on how to present quantitative data. I'll then wrap up the series with how to write the introduction conclusion sections to your Chapter 4, and then provide you a chapter wrap-up lesson. In this lesson, I will address the program information and give you an introduction to who I am. Then I'll get into the introduction to how to write Chapter 4 of your doctoral dissertation. I'll conclude with a reflective summary, or if you will, the highlights or the salient points of this lesson to help you remember those as you move forward then to the next lesson. As part of the introduction, I'd like to let you know that this program, Taking the B out of ABD, started in January 2014. That's when I started doing free webinars. I continue to do now. That's part of what I call my brain tithing. I like to tithe and give of the things that I have. And it's always free. It's probably where you found me at. And if you haven't, then go to my website at drrichschuttler.com and look for information on taking the B out of ABD, and you will gain more information on how you can subscribe and register to the free webinars that are going on right now. I'm Dr. Rich Schuttler, and I have been doing doctoral dissertation chair and committee member work for about 14 years now. I've been doing that at a number of different universities inside the United States as well as overseas, internationally, as an international visiting professor. Been very blessed to have the great opportunities. I also do research for my clients. I have a number of clients over the years that I've done research for, and I continue to do that as part of a consulting effort. I also do research in the books that I write, whether it be called the book, The Laws of Communication, the intersection where leadership meets employee performance, or my other book called Everyday Leader Heroes, 10 Characteristics in Everyday Leaders. I've used research, quantitative and qualitative research, to get the data to help me produce those books. Also, for a number of years, I was a dean at the University of Phoenix. Before I resigned to start my own business, I was reviewing doctoral dissertations on behalf of the university to either approve or not approve. So what I'm able to do here in this program is bring my lessons learned, my experiences, to help you better get through your program. It's my hope that my lessons and the work that I do with my mentees can be just as valuable to you as you move through your program. There are what I call many paths to the same destination, and by that I mean that I have my experiences from my journey. Your dissertation chair and other committee members have their own journeys. Now, there are times when we agree, because there's not one way always to do a dissertation. There are times when perhaps a couple different faculty don't agree with the same approach. That's because there are many ways to do a dissertation correctly. There are also many ways to do it incorrectly, but we want to help you better understand how to do it correctly. What I'm trying to indicate to you here is that make sure that if I give information that counters or is a little bit different than what you're getting from your dissertation chair or provided to you by your university, make sure you look into that and make sure that you are also then making the best decisions for your dissertation. There are different programs and different expectations. Because many of you who are enrolling in my programs and obtaining these lessons are from different universities around the world, I am providing what I believe to be general information that could serve everybody well. Your university may have some information that's a little bit different. For example, in lessons 1, 2, and 3, it's not uncommon for one university to not have certain information in Chapter 1 because they want it in Chapter 2 or Chapter 3, where another university would want the same information in generally all 3 chapters. These are what I call relatively minor, small pieces of information that can go anywhere based on the leadership of your university. But be rest assured, in Chapter 4, this is a lot easier because in Chapter 4, you're just presenting the data, and there's not a lot of variation in how and what universities expect in regards to what they're looking for. I'd like to tell you and remind you, at this stage, you are a researcher. You have finished your data collection. You are writing about your data and presenting it. Now you are a researcher. You have been doing research. Now, if you're just getting started and you're watching this strategy perhaps a little early so you can be better prepared when you're writing Chapter 4, that's great. But as you transition, you have to keep in mind that you will no longer be a student as much as you are going to be a researcher, an academic researcher at that. So congratulations, you are a researcher. Go tell everybody that you are a researcher now. Now let's get into the content of Chapter 4. Chapter 4 is about presenting the data. Presenting the data means that you're going to present the data based on how you collected it and provide some general meaning, but you're not going to evaluate it. You're just going to give the data. You're not going to indicate what it means or give any implications or conclusions or summarizing to provide some sort of meaning other than what is provided in the data itself. Chapter 5 is going to give you ample opportunity for you then to get into that evaluation of the data. You're going to synthesize the data from the many different points, and you're going to present it in Chapter 4. Chapter 5 is more about really analyzing it and giving ideas to other people on what that data means to you. In Chapter 4, you're going to have, of course, a lot of narrative information. Much like you do in every chapter, good paragraphs with information that flows well, but you're also going to have tables and figures. Depending on your research method and design and how much data you collected is going to depend upon how many tables and figures and how long Chapter 4 is. But as you go through this lesson strategy, you're going to find that I'm going to give you indications about how long it should be to be able to communicate what you need to in regards to presenting the data for others to understand. In Chapter 4, you are going to start out, perhaps after the introduction to the chapter, with information about the field test and the pilot test if you've done both, or if you just did one or the other, the outcome of that. Remember, you're going to present the data, so there's some outcome of that field test. Perhaps through your field test, while you may have wrote about it in Chapter 3, you're still going to allude to it here in Chapter 4 a bit. And if you did a pilot study after your IRB approval, and you have information that perhaps in that pilot study something changed in your survey or in your interview structure, then you're going to present that in Chapter 4. You want to basically let people know what was the outcome of that field test and or pilot study. Let's get into more information now about Chapter 4. This is going to be what I call statements without analysis. You may give a statement on whether a null hypothesis was rejected or failed to be rejected, but you're not going to analyze what that really means. You're not going to get into doing anything in regards to how that failing to reject or rejecting the null answers the research question. That's what you're going to do in Chapter 5. When you give in a qualitative study perhaps common themes that were generated by all the interviews you had accomplished, you're just going to give what the themes are and how they came to be and support evidence with it with quotes from interviewees, but you're not going to indicate what the common themes meant or what they could mean to other people. You're going to describe the survey population. Whether you interviewed 16 people and achieved data saturation, or you provided 300 Likert-type surveys and received back 225 usable surveys to run your data, that's what you're going to describe. Now in Chapters 1 and Chapter 3, you went into great detail about the scope of your study. Remember in Chapter 3, you told us who were going to be involved in your survey population. Now, perhaps maybe there were some changes because that's common when you do the research, but you're still going to give some information in Chapter 4 about that survey population. Chapter 4, if you think of it this way, you're going to go from broad to narrow. And what do I mean by that? I mean broad in the sense that if you interviewed 16 people and you had 6 interview questions each, that's a lot of transcripted dialogue that you have. You're going to narrow it down to a couple major themes that were generated or common themes from all those interviews. If you happen to collect 225 surveys and they had Likert type questions throughout it, that's a lot of data. That's a lot of numbers. You're going to take that down, you're going to do a statistical analysis, and you're going to help us understand what that means in a mathematical calculation, but also in rejecting or failing to reject the null. You're going to take all that information in the studies that you're doing and the data collecting, and you're going to make it what we call more manageable for somebody to read and understand from what you have done. You're going to have meaning generated but not assessed. Again, you're going to help us understand how you were able to reject the null or fail to reject the null in a quantitative dissertation, but you're not going to tell us what that meant. In your common themes in a qualitative study, that's what you're doing. The themes are meaning, but you're not going to assess that. And this is a challenge for many doctorate students because, many of you, and rightfully so, you're excited. You've done your data collection. You want to get this information out to the world, and you want to be able to say what the data means. But keep in mind, we don't really want to know what it's meaning from an assessment point of view. We just want to know what it means when you've taken the data and deduced it down into something more manageable. Remember, Chapter 5, you're going to have great opportunities to tell us about all the cool meaning and what people can actually do with the results of your study. Chapter 4 is all about summarizing the data. Summarize it and present it. You need to explain the data treatment. And what do I mean by that? That's a question that people always ask. What do you mean data treatment? I didn't treat it all. You actually are going to treat the data because if you're going to use SPSS to help you with taking the large amounts of volume of data and pulling it together that you can then use to do your testing, we want to know that you use SPSS. If you used an Excel file and program to be able to manipulate your data, then that's wonderful. Let us know that. If you used in vivo software, or perhaps you did it manually by creating an affinity diagram from all the answers, that's fine too. We just need to know how did you get from that broad perspective of all the data collected to the narrow. Just explain to us how you did what you did, and that would be fine. You need to provide the mechanics of the analysis. And in that, what I mean is particularly for quantitative work, if you did a chi-square or a t-test, put the formulas in there so that we can see the formulas and where you received the formulas from so that we can see exactly what mathematical formula you used. And then, of course, you would show the information with your numbers in that formula and show the outcome of that formula. But that's the mechanics of it. If you were able to do a qualitative study and you did a case study, for example, and you had all the information, you want to help us understand the mechanics of how you've taken the information from the different stakeholders, perhaps, and generated information from that data to each specific stakeholder group, and then what it meant together once you combined it. There should be no references in Chapter 4 in general. While for a qualitative study, you're probably going to do a lot of quoting, but it's going to be quoting from the people that you interviewed, not from authors of journals that relate to your body of knowledge or to researchers, because you've done that in Chapter 2 and Chapter 3 already. In quantitative work, I would suggest there are probably going to be a few references that you're going to provide, and those would be only, and I'll say only, that's my view anyway, only of where you received the formulas that you decided to use. Example, I talked about that chi-square test or t-test. Make sure that you provide a reference when you give us information on where you got the formula from. So if you got the formula from a textbook, or you did a fair share sampling and you took it from a fair share sampling calculator. Just help us understand where you got it, because what may happen is somebody may want to go and make sure that they have the same formula you used, because believe it or not, there is some variation in different formulas out there on, for example, a chi-square test or a t-test. Some authors have a little bit different variation. Or depending on how you took your formula and whether you used a certain confidence rate or not, we need to be able to know where you had received your formula from, just to ground your work in making sure that everything is done correctly. Now I'll give you a little bit of information about the introduction to the chapter itself. In the chapter introduction, you're going to give some information. I encourage you just to put in the purpose statement, because in the purpose statement, it will have the research method and design. We want to make sure as you start out your chapter that the introduction section gives the reader enough information to know what the study was about and what research method and design were applied, because in the chapter then you're going to present that data. There should be enough information in case the reader does not read other chapters. Now, you don't have to go in depth. Now, maybe it's going to be 3 paragraphs long, the introduction to Chapter 4. It may actually be even less. Depends on how your study was designed. For example, if you did a mixed method study, you're probably going to have a little bit more information in the introduction to your Chapter 4 than somebody who only did one of the 2 research methods. But ideally, I find that there's usually 2 paragraphs, but sometimes 3. Now, when you're writing about the qualitative work, you're going to have themes generated in Chapter 4. And you're going to have to decide the topics and priority. Is it going to be because who provided answers? For example, maybe theme number 1 was because there were 16 out of 18 people who agreed with the theme that was generated, and the theme number 2 that you're going to write about had only 13 people who agreed, and the third theme is going to be because 9 people produced information related to supporting that theme. That's possible. You're going to have quotes from the survey population in a qualitative study. You're going to have many quotes, and this will be word for word. Of course, you'll never have the name of the person you interviewed because you had created some sort of code. That way, the person is never related to in your study, and their privacy is protected. But you'll have quotes. For example, perhaps it was interviewee number 4, and you want to give a quote about what they said because that helps provide evidence for the theme that was generated. You have to prioritize the themes somehow, some way. Again, you may put them in a prioritized order, but it's not uncommon. And the reason I'm saying this twice is because I want you to consider this if you're doing a qualitative work. Let's just say, for example, you did a study, and others have done similar studies before. This is not uncommon. Most of us do studies that's a little bit different than what somebody else had done. And one of the themes generated or the data generated from your work suggested something new. Maybe it was a new theme that emerged that nobody's ever seen before or wrote about before, but yet it wasn't the most common theme. Maybe it was the 3rd most common theme. And you looked at it and you said, I never expected this to happen before. You may want to write your Chapter 4 starting out with that theme and justifying it, because you may be indicating in the content and the narrative that of all the themes generated, here is a new theme that was not seen in the body of knowledge before. This may be that one thing that you learn that helps to close the gap, and may be the real reason that your work is going to be significant, substantial, because it generated a new theme. Don't let something like that get buried down into the 3rd or 4th theme that you write about if it's most important to you. This is a great time for you when you're getting to this point, is to have conversations with your dissertation chair and committee members and seek their information or other experts in research in your body of knowledge, because many times students don't understand the true value of the data they have. Now, in a quantitative study, some of the things to concern yourselves about in Chapter 4 would be statistical calculations. Of course, that's how you're going to be able to reject or fail to reject the null. So in your Chapter 4, you're going to have a lot of statistical calculations. But they should be pretty similar. As I'll go into the other lesson, if you have 3 research questions and 3 independent variables and 3 null hypotheses, you will basically repeat the format and design of how you did the first one with the following 2 research questions. because there's no reason to come up with different approaches. You want to stay consistent and keep your work simple so that people will be able to understand your work easier. You're going to give information about the null hypotheses testing. Now, you're just going to indicate that the testing, what it was in regards to did you fail or reject the null or you reject the null, but you're not going to indicate what that means in regards to your research questions being answered. That you're going to do in Chapter 5. Because remember, in Chapter 4, you're just presenting the data. In a quantitative Chapter 4, I have my mentees design their chapters around the research question order. In Chapter 4 of a qualitative study, the flow of information is usually based on themes and how they were generated. But in a quantitative study, you're going to have your information designed from research question number 1, 2, 3, 4, and depending on how many research questions, that's the flow of your work. That's how my mentees do it. I've had that done whether there's 3 independent variables and 3 research questions or 11 research questions with 11 independent variables and 11 null hypotheses that were tested. Now, your chapter is going to have a conclusion. Every chapter does. Now, just some information here, and yes, I'm going to give more information in lesson number 11 in the Chapter 4 series, but just as an introduction for you, now keep in mind that your chapter conclusion will provide, again, the purpose of the study. What was the purpose of your study? A little bit about the research method and design. Now, if that's included, as it is in most universities, who require a purpose of the study to be designed, it usually contains the research method and design. A short review of the chapter content. You don't have to go into anything in depth. If you had 6 themes that were generated, that's pretty much all you have to indicate, that the themes generated from the data from the interviews are 6 themes, and give information in there as well should you have happened to have done a field test or a pilot study. And then provide a quick transition to Chapter 5. Now, you may have one paragraph that provides the purpose, the research methods, and a short review of the chapter content, and then another short paragraph. Remember, paragraphs need to be 3 to 7 sentences long, but have that second paragraph that gives a transition to Chapter 5. Let the reader know what's going to be following Chapter 4 when they're done with it. Always keep in mind, not everybody is going to read your dissertation from Chapter 1 all the way to the end of Chapter 5. Some people may only read the introduction of Chapter 4 and then decide if they want to read more, or they may actually just go to the conclusion. Everybody's a little bit different in what they're looking for. So write the chapter in a concise manner as you did with Chapters 1, 2, and 3. Now, as part of a reflective summary, I just want to let you know that I gave you some information about this program and a little bit of introduction to who I am and how this program came to be. I do believe that the value in this program is that I'm giving you insights that could help you on a 24-hour, 7-day-week basis. If you have a question, you can come back to these lessons. If you have any questions for me on anything, you can always email me anytime. And in this lesson, I cover the general concepts of Chapter 4. This is the introduction lesson. In the following lessons that remain, the other 11, I'm going to go in depth into each of the areas about how to write your introduction, the material within the introduction. Also, in this chapter, I provided the general concepts of what you're going to need to know about designing your own Chapter 4. In the remaining 11 lessons, I'm going to go in more depth on how to write your introduction, how to present your data, and then how to write your conclusion. Then I'm going to give you some tips and strategies to make sure that your work is developed well and in a manner that's going to bring great credit upon you and your university. The following lesson will be lesson number 2 of 12. And in that lesson, I will be presenting information about the field or pilot test. This way, you'll have more information about how to present those sections in your Chapter 4. As part of a quote, I have, be a lifelong learner, not a lifelong student. Don't get stuck in that 10-year plan. Get your doctoral dissertation done. I am pleased and I am happy that you allowed me to be able to help you. I do believe that Chapter 4 is almost as easy to write as Chapter 5. But do know, Chapter 4 is easier to write than any of the chapters in Chapters 1, 2, and 3 of your proposal. I honestly believe that Chapter 4 should be very easy for you to write. And with a little information taking your data and putting it in the right format will allow you to be able to put your chapter together in a manner for other people to understand how the data was generated and what that data is. Remember, you're only writing and presenting the data. Chapter 5, you will analyze the data and provide recommendations and conclusions. I'm Dr. Rich Schuttler. Thank you very much for joining me in this lesson strategy. I look forward to talking to you in the next lesson.